All right. This is a very important subject that we're going to cover today, and it's got great historic roots in our Phyllis Schlafly Eagles. Phyllis Schlafly began her career and was often described as, by a number of military leaders, retired military leaders, in the 1960s into the 70s, she was described as the greatest commentator on American military issues who had not served in the military. She was very well regarded, wrote a number of books 35 years before Star Wars with Ronald Reagan, the lasers to protect us. Phyllis wrote a book called Strike from Space. She was very clear on the threats coming from the world and from global communism. She, in the 1964 book, A Choice Not an Echo, which if you haven't read, you should read it, and kind of, as you read it, just change the names to Romney, Bush, Rove, and you'll have the whole sense. It was insiders were giving us losers, and those were the echoes, and we wanted a choice, and she was writing that. But in the book are lots of things, and one detail in the book is Phyllis and her husband. People talked about Phyllis's husband, Fred Schlafly. In fact, I was on a call, I told John this, I was on a call Tuesday night with the California Republican Party pro-lifers who are trying to protect the pro-life plank in the California Party, and we were strategizing. One of the roles we do is to help on these platform fights. And one of the guys on the call said, well, we're talking to the Schlafly guy, that was me. He said, I've got to give my Schlafly bona fides. In 1972, when I was arrested, Phyllis Schlafly gave me a free lawyer, and it was Fred Schlafly, and he got me off of whatever charge he had. And then there was another woman and said, well, I didn't know we were doing Schlafly bona fides. And she said, in 1984, I went and met Phyllis, and that launched me on my career. And I said, we got to cut this off now, these people, you know. we got to save the pro-life plank here, you know. So, but Phyllis, in 64, in the book, A Choice Not an Echo, wrote about a time that her and her husband, and John will correct me, but I think I got the story right. They heard that there was a conference at another resort near where they were staying on Sea Island, Georgia. And so they went over to that place, and either Phyllis or Fred, as I know it, bribed the concierge to get a list of who was there. And that was the first time, Phyllis wrote about it, that the Bilderberg group, which is another group that meets annually and has met since the late 1940s, of globalists. It included Kissinger and all sorts of other folks. In fact, that first roster, which was from the 1950s, includes names that later became prominent in the administration, unfortunately under Nixon, of all people too. So Phyllis was concerned about this question of globalists and the globalist influence. One more little example that lets us show the power of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles. There's one group in the country that every year dominates the conversation on patents in Washington, D.C., and it's ours. Meaning there's people that bribe each other. Pharma bribes one group, another guy's group, big tech bribes one group to censor. But we talk about the patent system as a property right that changed the world because America's Constitution. And Phyllis was a leader on this. The reason she had to become a leader was because in the 1990s, Bill Clinton, I mean, Obama's bad, but Bill Clinton had so many tricks up his sleeve. He decided he was going to harmonize the American patent system with Europe. Like we want to go, the EU is going to be a guide. And Phyllis said, what? You're going to change the patent system to be like Europe? And she started a battle that we fight today, and we every year, and we're succeeding with it in many ways. So Phyllis cared about this issue of globalism. We have two panelists today that are going to discuss this and take questions from you, so get ready. John Schlafly has played almost an unnamable number of roles in our organization, continues to be the head of our organizations, Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, Eagle Trust, but more than anything, for 40 years, he was the right hand to Phyllis Schlafly, and when she was succeeding in great production of content and writing, John was her editor, her researcher, her colleague. It was an extraordinary relationship and friendship that is I marvel at. I was wonderful to watch, especially as a mother and a son. It was extraordinary. So he's going to comment, and then of course Alex Newman, who we talked yesterday, is libertysentinel.org is his website. You can see a lot of his stuff there. He's written books and columns, and he's got a voice on a number of aspects of the American political and policy scene. but he's particularly also been speaking out about the influence on the COVID question of the international globalists and what they're doing. So enough of that. I'll leave it to these two, and thank you guys. I don't know who's going first, maybe wrestle or something.
Another wrestling match.
Yeah. Well, we have only one.
Mike's not on. Push it towards you. There you go.
We have only one microphone. But Alex was just asking me if I had read Phyllis's book, Kissinger on the Couch. And I said, well, yes, I proofread it when it was in manuscript. But so last night, one of our great participants stumped me with a question. He said, when did Phyllis, identify globalism as being a problem? When did she first started talking about globalism as an issue? Well, that stumped me for a second, because I think it goes all the way back to the beginning of her. I even remember as far back as the 1950s. I was just a child then, learning to read, but there was a campaign by the globalists then to repeal the Connolly Reservation to the United Nations, which is the provision that protects the United States domestic law from it being interfered by the United Nations. And so she was in the battle then. And now she came to national attention with this book, A Choice Not an Echo. She used different language then. I don't think she used the word globalist, but the main theme of this book is that the people who controlled the Republican Party then had the same foreign policy as the Democrats, and they believed in a bipartisan foreign policy. And so that regardless of which party wins, the foreign policies of our country, war and peace and international relations, would stay the same. And that was because the party was controlled by what we now call the deep state. And that means, the people in the permanent government they would continue with their uniform ideas. And Phyllis thought that we ought to have a debate on foreign policy just as much as domestic policy. And that's why she supported candidates for president, starting with Robert Taft in '52, Barry Goldwater in '64, and Ronald Reagan in '80, who had a very distinctly different foreign policy and believed in putting America's interest first. Now, if you read her original book, she did not use the term America first, because that phrase still had connotations, because that was the name of the organization that's opposed United States entering World War II, and she was leery of that phrase. But one of the wonderful things that's happened with Donald Trump is that he has completely exonerated the phrase America first. And that's now part of everyone's conversation now to define, and there's no better phrase to define what we mean. What Phyllis said in her book was to attack the bipartisan people in both parties who supported an America last foreign policy. And she used the phrase America last as what we were against and what we wanted to prevent, what we wanted to remove from the Republican Party. So that was her way of getting at that issue. So, let's fast forward, Alex. Of course, the Cold War ended thanks to Reagan, and then the first George Bush got in there, and he decided that we were in a new world order. That was his phrase for the end of the Cold War, and he declared that in his speech to Congress. We're in a new world order. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the United States has to police the borders of third world countries wherever it happened in the world, starting with Kuwait, an absolute anti-Christian monarchy, but we had to go to war to protect that ruler in Kuwait. So that was the beginning of the New World Order, and then with Clinton, and started on the expansion of NATO. Phyllis was very much opposed to the expansion of NATO to include, a dozen more countries moving closer to the Soviet Union. She argued that NATO had fulfilled its mission. It should go out of business. We didn't need NATO anymore. And but that didn't happen, and Bill Clinton, with relying on Madeleine Albright, his Secretary of State, who famously said, "What's the point of having a military if you don't use it?" And so he started a war in Yugoslavia, which accomplished no good purpose, but except to kill a lot of people and protect the boundaries of people who couldn't get along with each other. But the Bill and Hillary Clinton administration, and if you recall, that was, they were a team. They were co-presidents, essentially. And there was a writer at the beginning of his administration who wrote an article saying the end of nationhood. National sovereignty wasn't such a great idea. Within the next few years, nationhood will be obsolete, and all states will recognize a single global authority. So the Clintons thought that was a great idea, and they put that man in the State Department, and he then ran our foreign policy for the Clinton administration. And Clinton then embarked on a policy of having treaties, all sorts of things, which he said, Clinton's own words, all nations would be tied down by strings, like Gulliver, so that they would no longer be free to act, but would be tied down to international authority. And so the Bushes and the Clintons were really on the same page on these issues. Bush, supported the beginning of the what was then called Agenda. I forget the first one, but then it became Agenda 21 for the 21st century, and now it's up to Agenda, 30?
2030.
2030, okay. And which, committees and agencies of the United Nations will define the America's use of energy for the whole world. And so this is what globalism means. Globalism through treaties, through international organizations, will set the standards and the parameters for that which will restrain all nations in terms of what's really important. And yes, we can have our local bodies that meet, but they don't have any power. And it's like we saw what happened to Great Britain, which thought that its parliament was supreme, but only to discover that Britain was tied down by what the European Union had decided. So Britain decided we wanted to extricate ourselves from that international global authority, and they tried hard they voted to bail out, but it took them years to actually make that happen. And I'm not sure they really have been able to do that. So the thing about Donald Trump is that he has been instinctively, it's not just what he says, but it's his body language and his instincts that you can pick up for as long as he's been in public life. Going back to the 1980s, Trump was said that it was the United States should not be tied down by these people who are taking our money and pursuing their own agenda and not in our interests. Trump is instinctive about that, whereas every other candidate, including every other Republican who is running for president, and we saw them all in the debate, they are instinctively the opposite. And they instinctively believe that the job of the Republican Party is to do whatever the deep state tells them to do. And if that means policing the borders of countries we never heard of, well, then that's what we have to do. So with that, Alex has done some important looking into what's coming, because globalism is on the march, and while we weren't paying attention, the United Nations in New York has been hard at work with Agenda 2030, and they are going to decide, what the world economy and land use and energy use is going to be permitted to all nations in the world. And with Biden and Kerry, they're all on board with this. And the question is whether we think we have a two-party system, but the question is whether the other party, the opposition party, will jump on this issue and stand up for the independence and sovereignty of the United States to determine our own destiny, including our own economy, which includes our own use of energy and use of land and production of energy, which of course makes our entire economy work without dependency on China and the other countries in the world. So I'd like to invite Alex to fill in the gaps a little bit, if he, I know he can, to explain what's coming down the pike, Alex.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for being here. Again, what an honor. Actually, I was trained to be a globalist, believe it or not. I grew up all over the world. I lived on 4 continents, 8 different countries. Almost my entire life I've been overseas. And I went to school with the children of the global elitists, the people who were building this New World Order, as some of these globalists like to say. And so I was thoroughly brainwashed into believing that this is what we needed to do, that the fact that we had nation states was the cause of war, and if we could just get rid of nation states and just have all power concentrated in the UN, we'd be saved. We'd have peace and safety and all the rest of it. So I grew up kind of a revolutionary globalist, and then I started reading the Bible. And I came across the work of Phyllis Schlafly. And one of the books that played such a big role in my understanding of this early on was Kissinger on the Couch, which was written by Phyllis Schlafly and Admiral Chester Ward. Before I get to that, though, I want to point out that I am still a globalist. When Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning over the world, I will be very pleased when he's actually doing it here. But until then, God has ordained nation states. He says that repeatedly in the Bible. If you can go to Deuteronomy chapter 32, you'll see that God divided mankind into nations. He even fixed their borders and how long they'd be here. We read that again in Acts chapter 17. So God divided mankind into nations for his purposes. And if you want to read that whole story, it's in Genesis chapter 11. He said, spread out over the whole earth. And they said, nah, we're just going to hang out here and build a big tower. And we said, okay. And you guys know the story. So nations are a good thing. God divided us up into nations for a reason. And yet, there are diabolical efforts from the pit of hell to turn that around. And Phyllis Schlafly and Admiral Chester Ward expose this in a massive way in this book, Kissinger on the Couch. If even a fraction of our people understood what was exposed in that book, we wouldn't be in this mess. So one of the things that Admiral Chester Ward said is that there is a very powerful group of globalists in this country. They congregate around an institution called the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, very few Americans know anything about this group, and yet Hillary Clinton told us when she was Secretary of State that's who was telling her what she should be doing and how she should think about the future. Joe Biden, he was on a panel with the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, and he says, hi, I'm Richard. I work here at the Council, and Joe Biden says, and I work for Richard. And he probably does, right? And don't think I'm picking on Democrats. There's plenty of rhino Republicans who are involved in it. Dick Cheney was on the board of directors, although he never told the voters back home in Wyoming, as he likes to say. So this is a bipartisan monster. And one of the things that Admiral Chester Ward said after spending 16 years in this organization is that the primary purpose of this organization is to undermine the sovereignty and independence of the United States and to merge us into an all-powerful one-world government. Wow. He said there's no term in the American lexicon that they hate more than America first. Right? Actually, they identified, Phyllis and Admiral Ward in this book, an inner core within the Council on Foreign Relations that they said was dominated by bankers and the Rockefeller brothers that was really guiding the agenda. They said most of the people in this group are dedicated to this stuff, but the real core that's driving this is the Rockefeller brothers. Now, at the time that they published this book, this was not very well known. In the decades that followed, they started admitting this, right? David Rockefeller went to go meet his maker some years ago, and I can't imagine that went very well. But in his autobiography on page 405, he actually admits, you should read it, he says, some even say that we are part of a secret cabal conspiring with a secret group of internationalists, or as we would call them today, globalists, to build a one-world political and economic system, a one-world order, if you will. He says, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. Okay, this was published in his autobiography. I said that's a confession. The man should have been hauled off to jail right there. Conspiring against the best interests of our country with a secret cabal, totally unacceptable. And yet Americans didn't realize this, right? Of course, Bush admitted famously that the New World Order was here, and he gave us a good description of it. He went on television in 1991. And he said this was going to be a world where a credible United Nations, which to me sounds like an oxymoron, but leave that be. Credible United Nations was going to use its peacekeeping role. This is Orwellian UN doublespeak for their military, right? Their peacekeeping forces, or the weirdos with the blue helmets famous for raping children around the world. We're going to use these peacekeeping forces to implement the vision of the UN's founders, which that should tell you a lot right there. We know who the UN's founders were. Joseph Stalin sent Foreign Minister Molotov to represent the Soviet Union. We sent Alger Hiss, and of course they really liked Alger Hiss. They made him the first. They made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Abominations, and then we threw him in prison because we found out he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So he's kind of been wiped out of the history books. But those are the founders of the United Nations. And that this New World Order was coming, and we didn't really have a say in the matter. He said, when we are successful, and we will be, so this is not something that they're willing to discuss with us. Now, the strategy has kind of shifted a little bit, right? During the Cold War, it was just all about peace, and we don't want nuclear war. Well, when the Cold War officially ended, the Club of Rome got together, a bunch of globalists, Al Gore, Mikhail Gorbachev, all these weirdos, and they decided in this report, they actually put out a public report. It was called The First Global Revolution, and they said that now the Cold War's over, we need a new pretext. It's going to have to be environmental concerns and global warming. That's going to be the pretext that we need to continue centralizing power at the international level. They actually said the enemy then is humanity itself, right? Because we're causing global warming, allegedly, by the gas that we exhale called carbon dioxide. So they now have gotten Agenda 21 and now Agenda 2030. Actually, on Monday, the UN is having a major gathering. Of course, they have the annual General Assembly meeting. All the dictators of the world come together, all the kleptocrats, and they blabber about how wonderful they are. And they're also having on the sidelines of this the SDG Summit. So Agenda 2030 is 17, they call them Sustainable Development Goals. These are the SDGs, and you should read them. It's not a very long document. This was adopted in 2015. The head of the General Assembly called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And I'm sure God thought that was pretty funny. But so the Master Plan for Humanity, go read these. Right? Goal number 10 is basically National Socialism wasn't enough. Right? We need wealth redistribution, they say, not just within countries, but among countries, which translated from UN globalist speak means we're going to loot the middle class in the United States. We're going to redistribute their wealth to the kleptocrats who have either impoverished or kept the people poor all across the third world. Very, very clear. Goal number 4 is their strategy. We're going to brainwash your kids so thoroughly that not only will they submit to this abomination, they will embrace it. In fact, the language used in the text of this declaration, of this agreement, is they will promote sustainable development, gender equality, which is UN speak for radical feminism, dismantling the family, human rights, which is the UN's totally twisted version of rights. Right? In our system, God gives us rights. This is a self-evident truth. Government exists to protect those rights. Under the UN Declaration of Human Rights, government and international agreements give you privileges. Although if you read Article 29, none of these rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So it's like First Amendment. You have free speech unless Congress doesn't like your speech, in which case you don't have free speech. So very, very dangerous. Now, what is this new world order going to look like? Well, let's consult the globalists themselves. George Soros said in an interview with the Financial Times, I've got the video, he said we need to recognize that communist China needs to step up to the plate and own the New World Order. That was his terminology. They need to own the New World Order. This is the most murderous regime that has ever existed in all of human history. They've slaughtered 100 million people, not including the hundreds of millions of unborn babies that they murdered in abortions. Anybody who thinks that they need to own the New World Order in the same way he says as the United States owned the previous world order is absolutely bonkers. And yet it's the same thing that David Rockefeller believed. He wrote in the New York Slimes in 1973, you can go read it, it's in their archives, from a China traveler. He went over there with Henry Kissinger before normal Americans could go there. He said, the social experiment in China under the leadership of Chairman Mao is one of the most important and successful in all of human history. How anybody could think that slaughtering tens of millions of people and destroying a thousands-of-year-old civilization and enslaving 1 billion people is a success just boggles the mind. These are the words of a psychopath. These people need to be stopped. So I could go on and on. This SDG summit that they're having right now in New York is actually a precursor to a much bigger summit. Next year, 2024, exactly 1 year from today, they're going to be hosting what they call the Summit of the Future. Think of this as the Constitutional Convention for the UN. They've told us what they're going to do. Okay, the Secretary General of the UN has been putting out these policy briefs telling us what they're going to do in 2024. Read them. They're going to basically come out of the closet and say the UN is now your world government. And this is what they say in their own documents. I'll give you an example. I got this on the front page of the Epoch Times, my article in April, breaking the story. Nobody had talked about this yet. And I don't understand why. This is like some of the biggest news in the world. It should have been on the front page of every paper. Nobody said a word about it. This document says that in the event of a global emergency, the UN now needs all these new powers. They're going to become the primary decision-making authority over nation-states, the private sector, religious institutions, scientific organizations, regional governments like the European Union, the African Union, etc. And they give a whole list of possible international emergencies: environmental, war, economic crisis, COVID pandemic, or something that's not global, or something that's not an emergency. In other words, this is a blank check for the UN to assume all powers. This is unbelievably dangerous, even if you trust these people, which, of course, if you trust these people, you have some real problems with your thinking. So one of their strategies, of course, is regional government. They've outlined this many times. Henry Kissinger, I call him Rockefeller's poodle, he outlined this in 2014 in his book, World Order. He explained that the contemporary quest for world order, which just substitute order for government, is to pursue regional governments and then to merge all these regional governments into a one world order. That's what we're watching now. The European Union is now the government of Europe. Over 90% of the laws that Europeans are governed by come out of the European Soviet. The European Commission is like a hybrid legislative and executive body. They are making the laws now that govern the lives of 500 million Europeans. In the United States, we're very rapidly watching the expansion of North American bureaucracies, North American tribunals, etc. The Africans are having an African Union imposed on them right now. Vladimir Putin is building a Eurasian Union. And on, right? All over the world, we're watching this. And of course, they're going to use polycrisis, right? This is a big term that the World Economic Forum, the great resetters have been talking about. They intend to unleash crisis after crisis: economic crisis, health crisis, environmental crisis, you name it. And along with all this, I've been going to these UN summits for my entire career in journalism. Since I graduated in 2009, I've been going to these UN summits, the climate summits, the sustainable development summits. They're also now coming out of the closet on the weaponization of religion, and I'll probably stop here. But I was in Egypt at the UN Climate Summit 7 months ago or so, the COP27. Did it on the Sinai Peninsula, of all places. And they had hundreds of religious leaders from around the world representing basically every major religion that you can think of. And the Egyptian government didn't let them all go, they said, for security reasons. But they did this very bizarre ceremony, orchestrated in partnership with the UN. They walked up to the top of Mount Sinai, and they unveiled the new 10 Commandments. Yes. And I was actually able to interview the organizers of this atrocity. They didn't know who I was, so they spoke very openly on camera. 45 minutes I've got of these guys on tape. They said, we're bringing in the new 10 Commandments. We're also bringing in a new covenant, right? We had the old covenant, the new covenant. Well, we're ushering in what they call the third covenant, and we're going to use this to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Wow, that's interesting. And actually, right before this summit started, the UN put out a policy document. They said that the system of ethics and morality that evolved with mankind over the last few thousand years just wasn't adequate anymore. Mother Earth wasn't being properly cared for. So we need a new system of ethics and morality. So this is where they're going, folks. We have got to stop it. And I could say more, but This is coming. It's coming very, very rapidly. The Republicans in Congress have the opportunity right now to stop it. I've spoken with several members of Congress. In fact, for that article I did on the policy briefs, I contacted Mike McCall, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he expressed, nebulous concerns. I've got the quotes in the article if you want to see them. Oh, well, we're concerned about sovereignty. We're concerned that Joe Biden's going to advance his climate agenda without our permission and things. But if the Republicans in Congress don't get serious about stopping this, our national sovereignty is toast. So we've got to get serious about this, and I'll leave it there.
Well, we'd be happy to entertain any questions as soon as people come to the microphone. But just to pick up on one or two things that Alex said, people today, I guess, may not realize just how powerful the Rockefeller family was. They were by far they dominated the American economy and public affairs in the first half of the 20th century more than anyone ever has in our history, and the percentage of the economy that their wealth. And the Rockefellers installed Henry Kissinger in our government. Kissinger was Rockefeller's protege. Kissinger ran our government for 8 years under Nixon and Ford. And then Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, then selected Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. And he was in line to become president until the Republican Party rebelled against that. And Ford realized that Rockefeller could not be nominated by the 1976 convention. That was a close call. One other thing I wanted to pick up on, Alex, you mentioned the UN peacekeepers. One of the greatest crimes in history, really, I think, was that UN peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti. This was a horrendous crime. Haiti, the poorest country in our hemisphere, our neighbor. But as poor as they were, there was no cholera. Cholera is a biological agent which the UN peacekeepers brought to that island, and now they can't get rid of it. And it is causing tremendous distress and death to the poor people on that island. And it was the UN peacekeepers who were brought in by Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation who brought that disease to Haiti. And it was a tragedy and a crime. So in about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And the UN has never paid a price for that. No one has ever paid a price for that crime.
That concludes my comments. So yeah, just some quick points. Both Ed and both of you brought up the American Invents Act for 2011. Huge undermining, and I'm going to read that book that Phyllis talked about, that huge undermining, and McCall was for that. I had some pen on writing that legislation at the time. It seemed like a good idea. First Gulf War, April of 1991, I said, and I was in a cavalry unit on the front line, I said, if we stop now, we'll be back in 10 years, and we were. Let's see, yeah, Ryan Henry, one of Bush's senior people under Rumsfeld, 2007 at a small meeting I was at, said, yeah, this Iraq thing, it wasn't really worth it, and it was horrible that Ryan was like that, because I'd worked with him very closely with the creating the Free Iraqi Force to overthrow the regime. Horrible guy, and I had a big blowout with him on that. So Ryan Henry, one of the globalists. And then the humanitarian crisis, it's a legal term the UN always uses, and I learned that when I was in Bosnia in '97. You can't, they always use that because that's the legal term to execute and convene a donors conference. So whenever they use the term humanitarian crisis, pay attention, because that is actually a legal term. So they can convene a donors conference. Okay, here's my question. And I'll ask Tiffany during her panel. I think this is so important. In your thoughts, in this globalism, right now inside of America, we're seeing the greatest internal migration ever since blacks left the South after the Civil War, of blue to red. And oftentimes I get asked by individuals, by families, what do I do? Do I stay or do I move to red? What do I do? And I just say, I mean, I'm curious about what's your thoughts and guidance, because we're seeing this struggle play out right now in the greatest migration in American history. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? What is the best guidance? Do they stay and fight or do they leave?
Are you talking about the migrants across our southern border?
That's a separate issue.
Or are you talking about
From blue to red states?
Americans migrating from blue states to red states?
Yes, that's the question. What do you think? What's the best guidance to them? Stay and fight or rally in a red state?
Well, of course, it's easy for me to say stay and fight. You know, we still have to keep an eye on the Electoral College. Unfortunately, some of the people who moved from blue to red states may make it harder to win, harder for the next presidential candidate to win in the Electoral College. Got to keep an eye on that. Of course, I don't know how to. I mean, it's an individual choice. I don't know how to answer your question. What state do you live in, by the way?
Virginia.
Well,
So solidly, it's a red state.
Well,
but
it used to be
we fell asleep at the wheel in 4 key counties.
it was a red state except for immigration over the last 10 or 20 years, which has changed it a great deal. Now, are the immigrants who've come over the last years, are they, apparently some of them voted for Governor Youngkin. I guess it remains to be seen if that is a lasting change. Maybe we'll see that this year's legislative elections.
Yeah, one group that's very influential is the West Africans, and they're actually solidly red and Christian. So I mean, that's actually a great a group that is coming into the area. But it's a struggle because we just fell asleep at the switch 20 years ago and just presumed a red majority, and they took it from us in a matter of ways.
Yeah, I appreciate your question, Colonel. And I don't think there is any simple answer. I don't think there's any answer that applies universally. I could tell you what, if I lived in California or Washington or Oregon, I've got 5 kids, 13 and under. There is no way I'm sticking around in a state that says if I don't affirm my child's delusions about his or her gender, that I don't allow them to chop off their private parts, I'm going to lose custody of my kids, or that if they run away, the state can kidnap them and mutilate them. I mean, that is just so bonkers. We already had to flee one place. The most recent country that I lived in before coming here was Sweden, not on purpose. My wife is from there. And we were there when they passed this law banning homeschooling and forcing all private schools that were taking public money to start teaching the government's absolutely insane curriculum. And we didn't have any immediate plans to leave. Our children weren't yet mandatory school age, but that was the final straw. We said, we are not staying. I'm not willing to risk going to jail and losing my kids for that. But with all that said, we need people to stay and fight. So if I didn't have kids and I lived in California, I would probably stay and fight. But, it's really hard. And the reality is, folks, there's no place left to go if America falls. And if we all just congregate in Florida and Oklahoma and Texas, it's not going to work. So we've got to fight all across this country. We cannot let them have California. We cannot let them have Washington.
Well, I agree with that, Alex. And just to point out that there are more people who voted for Trump in California than in any other state except Texas. And I mean, California is full of good people and they need to be supported. And there are now 9 California school districts who have rebelled against the state and passed, the first one that did it, the Attorney General sued the school district. Well, there are 8 other school districts that have passed similar resolutions saying that parents do have rights over their children in the public school. And so this is a battle that's going to be fought in
My question's really simple. I'd just like to know the new 10 Commandments. I'm sure that more than one applies to education, and I was just wondering where we could get more information on that.
Thank you. I actually have a couple. I thought the religious angle was so important that when I got back from Egypt, I was supposed to do a cover story about the summit. And there was a lot of important things that happened at the summit. They came up with this incredible agreement that promises that the Western world is going to spend $4 to $6 trillion every year. John Kerry pled guilty on behalf of the United States for every hurricane, every storm, every drought, every flood that hits the throat. I'm serious. You guys think I'm kidding? He actually said we accept our historical guilt because we put CO2 into the atmosphere, and therefore we are to blame. So there was a lot of important stories coming out of there, but in my opinion, the most important story was this hijacking of religion, this abomination called the New 10 Commandments, where all these religious movements around the world, and it wasn't just Catholic and Protestant, they brought in Jews and Muslims and Hindus and pagan. They flew in a guy from the Amazon rainforest with a bunch of feathers and said he was a representative of pagan, Amazonian spirituality, every kind of religious leader you could imagine. So I do have a couple of copies of that. I'd be happy to give you one. You can read the 10 Commandments online. Some do deal with education. A lot of them are very nebulous, but some of them are just blatantly insane. It says like compassion means hearing the cries of Mother Earth. You're like, what? Where does this stuff come from? And of course, it comes from the pit of hell. So talk to me later, and I'll give you a copy of the magazine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm hearing from smart, reliable people that there's actually a Chinese land grab happening here in the United States. Is that real? And then what's the diabolical plan? Like, what's the worst case scenario from them doing that?
You want to take that, John?
Well, Chinese nationals, citizens, foreigners are buying up land in the United States and companies, and a state of Florida passed a law to prohibit that. It was immediately challenged in court, but the first court ruling is to uphold the law. So we'll see how far that goes in the legal system, but so far the Florida law has been upheld by the first judge's ruling, that was a legitimate and not discriminatory in a way that's prohibited by our laws.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think this needs to be seen in context. What is happening right now is the deliberate building up of communist China and the deliberate undermining of the United States and the Western world. This is not a new process. It actually goes back to the very beginning. It was subversives in our State Department and our Department of Defense that put that monster Chairman Mao in power in the first place. Nobody likes to acknowledge that. Chiang Kai-shek was our ally. My grandfather fought alongside Chiang Kai-shek's men against the Japanese in World War II, and our government betrayed him. He was a Christian. He believed in the American ideal of government, and subversives within our government, some of whom were later exposed as communists and Soviet agents, stuck a knife in his back, and they put an arms embargo on him so he couldn't fight Chairman Mao and his butchers. And they brought Chairman Mao to power. John F. Kennedy talked about this on the floor of Congress. It's one of the most horrific elements of modern, contemporary American history, that we betrayed the people of China into communism. And that has continued at every step of the way. China is a threat to the world today because of the U.S. government. I say it unequivocally, and because of U.S. corporations that have built this monster. And it's going on to this day. In 2015, I was at the UN Climate Summit in Paris. And incidentally, I had CHICOM agents following me around with a camera taking pictures. We filed a report with UN police and the French Interior Ministry that said, nah, sorry, there's nothing we can do. This is UN territory. But what happened there, and so few people picked up on this, was absolutely insane. Barack Obama said, we're going to slash CO2 emissions in the United States by 30% within the next 10 years. And he told us what that was going to do. He said, under my plan, electricity prices are going to skyrocket. Those were his exact words. And he was telling the truth for once. Electricity prices skyrocketed. The Communist Chinese said, oh, that's great. Thank you, Mr. Obama. We're going to be increasing our CO2 emissions until like probably 2030, give or take a few years, and then we'll see what happens come 2030, and you know communists. So while the United States is dismantling its energy infrastructure, stopping energy extraction, shutting down our manufacturing, causing factories in the United States to move their operations to China because they can't afford to compete in international markets if they're operating in the United States, the Communist Chinese are building coal-fired power plants faster than we can count them to power the factories that are making the stupid solar panels and windmills that Biden is buying with our tax money. This is a fraud of monumental proportions, and it's very deliberate. As they destroy the U.S. economy, they destroy our national security. We can't fund a proper defense or military if we ruin our economy. This is all deliberate, folks. This is all deliberate. And when you understand that, you realize the big mess that we're in, and the land grab is one small piece of a massive puzzle. Thank you.
Short remark on the question. Every time anybody ridiculizes the notion of world government, global management, I recall Lasse Oppenheim, the greatest mind of British Empire, international law. Professor Oppenheim wrote exactly 100 years ago in his last essay on the future of international law, "It is my firm conviction that the word state is in no form practically useful or desirable, for it will bring death instead of life." And the same notion of world government or global governance is brought back just now in Europe by the greatest mind of legal philosophy in Europe, Jürgen Habermas. Just 10 years ago, he wrote a plea for constitutionalization of international law, when he presents European Union as an example for the future global government, as an example for European Union, how to create this feeling of citizenship, of multinational community, and how it should be brought to the global level. So the doctrine, from the legal point of view, from the scientific point of view, is already there. It is prepared, and it just needs to be implemented. I will be on Monday in New York during the SDG summit, taking part in some of the meetings, and probably I will be one of only few voices against this globalization. And the question is how to react, because no international cooperation will react against globalization. It needs a grassrooting opposition. But this grassrooting needs to be a global grassrooting opposition to the globalization efforts. So probably some kind of not intergovernmental, but inter-NGO cooperation is needed.
Thank you. I don't know if that requires a response. John, do you want to?
Well, I believe that the United States, under our Constitution, as an independent state governed by our Constitution, written 240 years ago, but by some of the greatest men in history, is the best protection, for peace and security, at least for our nation. The European Union, as I understand it, its primary goal was to prevent any further wars in Europe after the great wars of the 20th century, but I don't think that it succeeded in that. But what it has done has been to burden, I think, all of the countries who are members with a bureaucracy and with policies that their people don't support. That's how it appears to me from the other side of the world, and I welcome to have your further thoughts about it. It was interesting that the concept of global governance began 100 years ago, so it's not nothing here is new.
Go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that, and I do agree that we need international cooperation among people who want to stop this move toward globalism. I would say I think Americans are probably the most significant and the most important obstacle standing in the way, and I do believe that we single-handedly can stop this beast still, even though they've undermined our country so much. And so I would say a couple things. Congress right now, as this budget fight heats up, has the ability to defund all these things. I've spoken to several members of the Appropriations Committee, and they tell me they are determined to stop the funding for a lot of this stuff, the World Health Organization, the UNESCO. There was even a lot of talk about defunding the UN's general operating budget. I think this is excellent. Now, we all know what's going to happen. Joe Biden's going to cry, and they're going to call Republicans terrorists, and they're going to say that it's because of Republicans that babies can't eat and the troops aren't getting paid. We need them to stand firm and hold the line. Don't fall for the Democrat and the left-wing media propaganda. Second of all, there's been a wonderful bill introduced in Congress for decades called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. It's a brilliant bill. It's only a few pages long. It would cause the United States to repeal the United Nations Participation Act. It would end our agreements with all these sub-agencies like the World Health Organization, and it would remove their headquarters from our shores, and it would ensure that our troops could never participate again. The guy who was first pushing this bill, Congressman Larry McDonald, 40 years ago last week, his plane was shot out of the sky by the Soviet Union. Horrific tragedy. He was actually a Democrat, but one of the most conservative members of Congress. And so in his honor, we should continue that. They continue to introduce that bill. Thomas Massey, who I interviewed about this last year, he was the most recent one to introduce it. Ron Paul carried the torch for a while. We need to get that passed eventually. It's not going to happen this session. It's not going to happen while Joe Biden's in the White House. But hey, 2024, Republican Congress, Donald Trump in the White House, who knows? Now, last but not least, right now we know we're not going to stop this at the federal level. We need our state governments to take immediate and urgent action to stop this. I'm very pleased that my state of Florida has been a leader on this. Many other states are moving in this direction. We can pass bills, we can pass laws right now saying no state or local government agency, employee, or resource may be used to enforce any UN or World Health Organization or UNESCO policy, opinion, mandate, preference, whatever, and we will not comply. And it's that simple. And if you send minions in here to try to make us comply, we're going to treat you just like we would any other criminal. We're going to put you in jail. So I'll leave it at that.
Quick comment from Noreen.
Yeah, my quick comment is, this is a wonderful presentation. You're right, we need grassroots. You're right, we really are the majority still, and we need to follow the Constitution. So I would encourage everyone to go to that hand-counted booth there and try it, because we would be winning if we had real counting of our ballots and honest elections. So we will still win. It's worse on the other side in their back rooms. So please, everyone, go to the hand-counting ballot booth, because we're ahead.
Good,
really.
thank you, Noreen. So we're going to trade out. Our next panel is education. We're going to be quick because we've got a lot to cover. Thank you, Alex and John, and they're around and very accessible online, too. Thanks, guys.